Welcome back to the show. Today, my theme is called a radical change, And a good chunk of what I want to talk about here today is from the Bible and the radical changes that happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's dramatic, I'll put it that way. So I want to start in the New Testament in the book of Matthew, chapter 15. I want to share a piece of that. It says, then the scribes and the Pharisees, now let me just back up a second. The scribes and the Pharisees are at that time, 2,000 years ago, the religious rulers of that culture, that Jewish culture in Jerusalem. They ruled the entire area. So again, Matthew 15. Then the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, quote, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. So he answered to them, why do you transgress the commandment of God? Because of your tradition. Now stop and let me just broaden that brush a little bit more. There were systems, there were habits, there were written rules that the Jewish people had to follow 2,000 plus years ago. And one of those, which is still in some groups here today, is they wash their hands in a certain way and they say a prayer before they eat. Well, the followers of Jesus who were raised Jewish, and then after they started to follow Jesus, they no longer practiced that rule of washing their hands and saying this particular prayer. So Jesus was turned the conversation around on them and said that why do you negate what was written in the Old Testament because of the new rules that they added to what the Old Testament wrote down. So again, the big picture today is a radical change. So the experts of the law, in this culture at least, were about to add new rules, new addendums to what was already written. And there were hundreds of laws, hundreds of rules that people had to follow. But then they chose to add more rules to it to make it even more difficult for people who were practicing this Jewish faith. So Jesus came along and, if you will, rewrote what the rule book was to make it a whole lot more easier to follow. So what we read throughout history and throughout the New Testament of the Bible is that the rules that Jesus brought along were a whole lot easier to follow than what the Jewish people at that time were implementing and were forcing people to follow. So let me kind of expand this concept a bit here today. A guy named Stephen Furtick writes, it's easy to criticize context that you've never experienced. Again, it's easy to criticize context you've never experienced. I've been around cultures and people and families and environments that at the beginning, I didn't understand why they did certain things and why they behaved in certain ways and or why they developed certain habits of doing things until I stepped back and realized that if I lived in that environment, I would probably be doing and believing and behaving in the same way. And I think sometimes you and I, if we want to do things that are different and or that are beyond what we've experienced up to that point, we have to place ourselves in the lives of people that do things differently than we do. Let me give you an example. There was a time there was a holiday for a Muslim family that I'm very close to. So they invited me to this holiday, and it was over at their house, and there were, I want to say, 25 other people there that were Muslim, and I'm not a Muslim. And I was sitting on the sofa, and I had crossed my leg over my other leg, so the bottom of my foot was obviously in the air and facing somebody. After I got home, I realized I was so stupid, because in that culture, when you show the bottom of your foot to another person, that's an insult. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking it was comfortable for me at the time to cross my leg. The point of that being is that in order for you to truly understand the culture in which that you're trying to impact or to be impacted by, you have to understand what the rules are of that culture. So in order to make a radical change in the culture, in your own mind, you have to get into the hearts and the minds of the people that are around you. Gandhi said one time, he said, be the change that you wish to see in the world. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. And Gandhi was a great example of the change. In fact, there were many people around him that were challenging him to do things like other people have done before him, i.e. going to war, creating an army, and doing all these other things that have worked, in quotes, over centuries. But he decided to do things that were different, that were out of the box, and that is to be peaceful, to do things that were not so normal. A guy named Rob Seitman said, here's to the crazy ones. He said the misfits and the rebels. He said the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, you can disagree with them, you can glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is really ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward, and while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy, listen, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Now, if you look throughout history, the people that, generally speaking, change the world believe that they can change the world. Let me share just a few more examples with you today on the show. The New Testament is jammed full of situations where Jesus was one that wanted to change the rule books of how society was run back then. Let me give you another story. In that culture, there were people that were sick, like in our culture today, that they are people that they had diseases, like today. But in that part of the world, in that religion, the sick people could not get around people that were not sick. Let me give you a more detailed example. There were people in that part of the world called lepers, L-E-P-E-R-S, and they had skin diseases. And sometimes the skin disease was so bad that they would lose their fingers, or their fingers would fall off, or they couldn't feel their fingers or their toes, and eventually those parts would fall off. Well, in that culture, the religious people were not allowed, in quotes, to hang around these sick people, these diseased people. Well, Jesus totally turned that around and said that, he's not one like the religious folks. He goes out to the sick people and to hang around the sick people. In fact, he said his own words, or somebody's words, that he came to seek and to save those that were lost and sick. So he chose to do a 180 on what the culture had been teaching for a couple thousand years at that time, and decided to put that to the side and said, I'm not going to be apart from the people that are different and sick that I'm not sick. I'm going to go out to them. So there came a time when Jesus wanted to heal somebody who had this illness. So he touched them, literally, and the religious people around him were freaked out. They're like, how can you possibly do that? If you're a rabbi, which Jesus was, how can you touch the people and help them? Because the rule book says you're not supposed to touch them. Well, Jesus decided to, in essence, rewrite that rule book. And I wonder if you and I understand that there are times in your life and my life that we have to, let me put it a different way, that we have an opportunity to rewrite the rule book. Think about that a minute. Think about all the inventions and all the stuff that's happened and has happened and will happen over the years. It's as a result of people rewriting the rule book. Think about that for a minute. Nelson Mandela said one time, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Education, that is to rewire, to rethink, to redo what has already been done. Think about this today. In fact, what Christ taught was he talked about mercy. He talked about making an impact on people's lives as a result of, in my paraphrase, is to place yourself in other people's shoes. He says that he would rather us show compassion than to be judgmental of people. Let me share another story. There's a story that Jesus told about this guy, this This guy that was not of his faith, of his religion. In fact, he was despised. His group of people were hated by the Jewish people. So this particular guy, was on his way from one city to another, and he was robbed. He was attacked. He was left on the side of the road, and he was dying. So one day, as he lay on the side of the road, this stranger in this part of the world, a religious guy came by and saw him on the side of the road and kept walking. He was religious. He could have helped him. He had the means to help him, but he kept walking. Another religious guy come by. This religious guy was a priest. He was a little higher up on the totem pole. So he came by and he walked past this guy, and of course, he didn't want to become unclean because the guy was bleeding and he was messed up. And how dare he touch this guy, because it would have messed up his beautiful religious clothing. So he kept walking. So then there was another guy who came by that wasn't religious at all, really, but he saw the need. He saw this guy hurting, and he decided to make a difference in his life. So he stopped on the side of the road. He bandaged up what he could, and he took him on his vehicle, and in this case it was his horse or a donkey, and he decided to take him to a hotel to where he could get some care, some medical care. So he told the guy in charge of the hotel, or the inn they called it in that text, that here's some money to take care of what needs to be taken care of, and if this is not enough, let me know and I'll bring more to you next time. The point being here, this story, is that the people or the person that you would not have thought of that made a difference was the one who made a difference. The people that should have made a difference didn't make a difference because they didn't want to get themselves dirty or tarnished or become unclean as a result of associating with somebody that were, in their mind, were less than them. That were unclean, that were unholy. This is the radical change I'm talking about, how Jesus taught his followers, the folks that eventually were called Christians, to treat people around them, to view them with compassion instead of with judgment, with embracing them instead of standing afar off. There's another story about a guy that was an employee of the government of that time. His name was Zacchaeus, and the story says that he was kind of short in stature. I don't know if he was a dwarf or he was just short. So there came a time, now this guy Zacchaeus was hated because there was a tax, an annual tax, the story says, and not only was there a tax, but Zacchaeus would add a little bit more to that tax and pocket the rest. So he was very wealthy as a result of embezzling money from people that he had power over, let me put it that way. So one day, Jesus was coming through town, and Zacchaeus, because he was short, he wanted to see Jesus, but everybody was much taller than him. So he decided to climb up into what was called a sycamore tree at that time, climb up a tree so he could see Jesus from a higher angle. So Jesus made his way through town, and people were all around him because he was famous by that time. And he noticed Zacchaeus up in a tree. Now, mind you, Zacchaeus was hated. He became rich through embezzling money from his fellow people in his own town and beyond. So he was not very liked at all. So Jesus looked up, knowing who Zacchaeus was, and Zacchaeus, he called him. He said, Zacchaeus, what are you doing up there? So he called him down out of the tree, and Jesus then invited himself to Zacchaeus' house for a meal. Now think about this a minute. Jesus is a rabbi. He was already skating on thin ice because he was hanging around sick people and doing things that were counter to what the Old Testament taught, that the Jewish culture was saying that you should do certain things in a certain way, and Jesus set that aside for the sake of other people that were hurting in his world. So he decided to call the Zacchaeus down out of this tree and invite himself to a meal. And not only did he invite himself to the meal, but it wasn't just Zacchaeus and Jesus. Many of Zacchaeus' friends were there too, that were not so honest and ethical. So one day, the Jewish leaders found out about it, and they were like, this can't be really happening, because they're rabbis too. They would never be in the same room with a guy who embezzles money, right? So Jesus had this meal with this guy. And then Zacchaeus said at the end of the meal, he says, my paraphrase of the story, is that as a result of Jesus taking time and investing time with me, I'm going to stop stealing money from people, and I'm going to pay back a few times over the money that I've stolen. Think about that a second. What if Jesus would have ignored Zacchaeus because of his reputation and he saw him up in the tree for sure out of his side. He saw him in the tree, but chose to ignore him. How many times haven't you and I ignored people in the store because we don't want to have a conversation with them, because we don't like them, or they have a reputation, or they've screwed us over once or twice or 3 or 4 or 5 times. We don't want anything to do with them. But Jesus saw an opportunity to make a difference in this guy's life, which then mushroomed into Zacchaeus impacting lots of other people's lives for the better. We're talking about a radical change here today, about doing things that are different for the benefit of other people. We're talking about showing mercy when sometimes people don't deserve mercy. Mother Teresa said one time, I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. Let me share it again. She said, I cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. Think about that in a minute. This is exactly what Jesus seemed to have been doing. He was casting a stone into some water, and then those waves just created more change that now we're still talking about Jesus, 2,000 some years later. The great author William James said, act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. Act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. Again, Jesus was looking for compassion more than he was looking for following the system of that time. And I wonder if you are, or maybe I am, stuck in this system, this rut of doing things in a certain way, that if we could potentially look at things a little differently, we could look at ways to impact people in our lives. Because when you impact somebody for the better, it doesn't just impact that person. It impacts their family, it impacts their friends. In fact, just yesterday, as I taped this show here today, a guy named John McGinnis, he had a birthday. John McGinnis is a guy that believed in me way before I believed in me. John McGinnis is, I can't thank John enough for what he's done for me and for my family. And we're talking way back in August of 1988. He saw in me something that I didn't see in me. And you could see today that I still struggle with certain things. That's very frustrating, very embarrassing. But sometimes when you invest in people, I'll say it more times than half the time, when you invest in people, you don't know the potential that person has in them that can create opportunities in the lives of other people as a result of that initial investment. Think again back to the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus chose to look up into the tree, notice the guy in the tree, invite him down, say, I'm coming to your house for a meal. As a result of the meal and the conversation, created a lifestyle change for Zacchaeus. But what if, again, I'm repeating, but what if Jesus would not have noticed the guy in the tree and invited himself for the meal, had the difficult conversation for the sake of Zacchaeus? This is how Jesus was able to build such an awesome team and created this new religion that was, at least in his mind, a distribution of love instead of judgment, because that old culture, that old system of the Old Testament in the Bible was all about judgment. There were hundreds of laws on the books back then, and to the point of if you picked up a stick on the wrong day, you could have been killed. That's how, forgive the term, crazy the rule book was back then. That if you picked up a stick on the wrong day or touched a certain object, you could be killed. Or were hanging around with the wrong people, you could be killed. Let me share another story. Jesus, one time, he was thirsty, and he went to a well in this particular town. And when he got to the well, there was a woman who was drawing water from this well. Again, we're talking 2,000 years ago. And he asked her to draw some water for him. Now, let me set the scene. Jesus is a rabbi. Rabbis were not permitted to really hold conversations with females. Well, this female was a little different than the average female. So to make a long conversation shorter, this woman was, let's just say, had loose morals. She slept around a lot. She had many male companions, and the guy she was living with was not her husband. She was married, but living with another guy. So for a rabbi, that's the last female type person that you should be hanging around in that culture. Make a longer story short, Jesus had a short conversation with this lady, and as a result of the conversation, she went back to her town, shared the story and the conversation she had with Jesus, and transformed the lives of a lot of people in her town, including her own life, by the way. Now, what if Jesus would not have had the courage to have that conversation? Again, I go back to the words of Mother Teresa. I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. In fact, Jim Rohn, the late Jim Rohn, great teacher, great guy, he said, you cannot change your destination overnight. You can change your direction. You can change your direction. I'm asking you today, if you want to change, if you want to have a dramatic or radical change in your life, you have to consider doing things differently than you have done them so far. And that's how evolution has happened. Not evolution as in dinosaurs and mammals and human beings, but how change has happened throughout history. That they've looked at things differently, looked at how things can change, developed new relationships and new types of relationships, and some really cool stuff has actually happened. A guy named Sean said one time, small changes can make huge destination differences. Small changes can make huge destination differences. We often think that sometimes you have to have these radical changes in order to create radical change. Let me say it again. Sometimes you think that you have to have radical changes in order to create radical change, when sometimes it's just the small adjustments in your life that can create radical change. Let me give you an example. Just in the last less than a week from the date we taped this show, I decided to stop eating as many, I'm embarrassed to say, hanging my head in shame, eating less potato chips at night. Yeah, I have a problem with potato chips. I love potato chips. And I know that you eat a bag of potato chips in a week, it's going to show up in your belly. So I went out to the store and bought some bananas, and the last at least 2 or 3 nights from the taping of the show, I've eaten a banana about an hour, hour and a half before bed instead of potato chips, which I'm still craving to this day. But I realized that if I don't stop doing some of the things that have created the situation that I'm in currently health-wise, then my situation's not going to change. And again, I'm talking about radical change, that the radical changes don't have to be radical changes, but there need to be some changes in order to create a radical change. Hence, about staying in shape and working out and doing all the things that I've talked about on this show for a long time. Small changes can make huge destination differences in your life. Seth Godin said, he says, art only isn't a painting, it's anything that changes someone for the better. Again, it changes someone for the better. Jesus' goal at the time was to change people for the better. So he decided to have these conversations. He decided to touch people. He decided to heal people. He decided to break the barrier between the religious culture of the time to a relationship of people that were distant from religion, that were distant from relationships, and then he embraced them. He was the proactive one and went after the people that were far from where he wanted them to be. Seth Godin writes, The secret to being wrong isn't avoiding being wrong. The secret to being willing to be wrong, and the secret to realizing that wrong isn't fatal. Think about that a minute. That wrong isn't fatal. So if you want to have radical change in your life, if you want to create ripples in the world around you, you and I'm reminding myself too in all of the shows that I do, by the way, that you and I have to remember to take consistent steps in order to create the radical change that you want to see in your world, that maybe you don't want to take, a leap of 5 steps forward because maybe you're afraid of those 5 steps. But maybe if you take a half a step a day forward within a week or two's time, you're going to be a lot farther ahead than where you are right now. I'm asking you to think about the changes that you want to make in your life. Think outside the box. Be proactive and go after the people that you want to impact in your own life. And you're going to see in a relatively short amount of time that radical change for the better is going to impact your life and the people around you. My name's John Carver. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back really soon. Thanks so much.